Hello and welcome to the Thriving Kids podcast, Q&A edition. I'm your host, Dr. Dave Anderson. Today we're answering parenting questions that came in following last week's episode with Dr. Mark Brackett. That conversation sparked a lot of reactions, especially around kids' emotions, how we talk about feelings at home, and how children learn the skills to understand themselves and others. We've got a wide range of questions this week from parents about big feelings, screen battles, friendship drama, and kids who shut down at home. I'm taking it as an indication of just how vibrant our listener community is getting on the Thriving Kids podcast. This is really great stuff. These are real situations that show up in everyday parenting. Let's get into it. Our first question for our Q&A episode this week. My 6-year-old melts down over tiny things, like the wrong color cup. How do I handle these big feelings without giving in every time? Got to say, this one's close to home for me because as I'm recording this episode, my wife and I have a 6-year-old daughter and a 9-year-old son. So clearly, there are some things that we are dealing with at the same time as our listeners, including melting down over little things. This is a really common question about emotion regulation and how we kind of cope with big feelings. So I've said this in a couple of episodes before, but to quote one of my favorite friends and colleagues, host of the Raising Good Humans podcast, Eliza Pressman, all feelings are welcome, all behaviors are not. So when we talk about a 6-year-old, it is perfectly typical and within the developmental range for a 6-year-old to be having really big feelings about a cup. At the same time, while we might be trying to help coach a 6-year-old through that, we want to remember that as they're maybe behaving around the particular cup, we might not necessarily need to tolerate how they speak to us, or if they throw the cup, or knock the cup over, or hit us because they're melting down over these things. And our focus is on kind of two different pathways. One pathway is helping them to regulate their emotions. We, as parents, serve as kind of their co-regulator in this situation. And this is especially true in my wife Dylan G's research and in her research with colleagues. When you map emotion regulation circuitry in the brain, what you find is that the presence of a parent and the quality of attachment to a parent on up to about age 10 really dictates the quality of that co-regulation. So what we want to be thinking about in a situation like this is that the quality of your connection with your kid already tells you how well you're going to be able to help them regulate in these situations. So that's something to work on after the ball, or you're kind of off the ball in terms of the way that we play defense. Making sure that our relationship is really close and the kids see us as a support really helps us in these big feelings moments. Then, in the midst of big feelings, if your child's having those feelings, we want to think about this kind of range of ways that you cope with those feelings. And merging second wave and third wave psychology, the way that we kind of characterize this is there are certain things you do, but then there's also moments where you don't necessarily have to do anything about your feelings. You might just be riding the wave of those feelings. So when we're looking at 6-year-old coping, we want to help a 6-year-old to do any number of a few things. And you don't have to do this in every single trial. But one thing is understanding they are feeling a feeling, perhaps naming that feeling, and understanding its intensity, how much they feel it. That skill alone, and this relates to what we discussed on the podcast with Dr. Brackett last week, can be immensely helpful in helping someone to be able to seek social support about their feelings, communicate those feelings to a friend or a partner or a relative in the future, and making sure that when people are more in touch and aware of the fact that they are having feelings, they might be more likely to deal with that feeling in a somewhat helpful way or cope with that feeling in a helpful way. So the first part is just labeling and understanding feelings. The second part is what parents often think of as coping skills. And there are a variety of ways that these skills are applied with, say, a 6-year-old kid to all kinds of different success and failure. In the sense that a lot of times parents are told you can teach your kid deep breathing, or you can teach your kid to contract their muscles, or you could teach your kid to take a walk or take a break. All of these are great coping strategies. And what we have to think about is that individually they may or may not work for certain kids. Certain kids may really want to take a break. Certain kids may want to do a distracting activity that helps them to calm down. Certain kids may just want to talk it out. And all of those things are welcome as particular coping strategies. Certain kids may also just not want to talk at all. They might not want to do an activity at all. They might just want you to give them a moment to feel what they're feeling before they can kind of come back. Again, we're making space for that experience. We're giving them options as neutrally as we can and without acting like it's, a command they need to follow for coping with that feeling. And sometimes there's just nothing to do. You can't really change your situation. We've only got one cup that's clean. We have to wash the rest of the cups. And so that's just the cup. We're going to place it there. And whether a child gets frustrated with it or whether a child is happy about it, we're just going to ride that feeling out. There's good water in that cup, or there's good milk in that cup, or there's good juice in that cup. We're just going to be here. The last thing I'll get into about handling those feelings that we're always talking with parents about is that as you're helping your kid in any given trial to understand their feelings, to label their feelings, to engage in any number of coping strategies, or just to sit with the feeling and let them know, hey, I'm here. I know that you're having some big feelings right now. I just want you to know I'm with you. Um, if a kid does cope with their feelings by hitting or by throwing things or by making a mess, it is okay to understand that you might want to set boundaries because all behaviors are not necessarily welcome. You might need to say, look, I'm removing, like it's kind of a natural consequence, like I'm removing the cup because you've knocked it over, or I'm going to move a little bit further away from you because I don't see you being safe with your body right now. So there can be that kind of label. Or there are moments where parents might need to say, look, we may not be able to do the next activity, or I may have to remove some time from this preferred activity you're doing later in the day because you're not able to do these things. Or we might need to take a little time to sit and think about how we're dealing with these big feelings. Again, it's really okay to keep your reactions kind of within that zone. The last thing that I'll say about these reactions, where I've got parents already thinking about upping the quality of their relationship with their kid, gently prompting coping skills, and also, thinking about when the behaviors might not be welcome, is just that your regulation in the moment is paramount in helping a kid feel like the little things that they're reacting to in life and the meltdowns, the big feelings they feel aren't necessarily matched by your own emotional consternation. The only way to really help them downregulate and to train those neurons to fire together and wire together is if we, to some degree, not saying in every single trial, but are demonstrating our own emotion regulation, our own coping, so that they can follow our modeling. Last thing I'll say, and we'll put in the show notes, is that if you're thinking to yourself, well, wait a second, how do I teach my kid the coping skills that you're talking about for these big feelings? We have a series that we've developed in partnership with Governor DeWine of Ohio and Governor Newsom of California, where we have differentiated video curricula teaching these skills completely available free on our website, childmind.org, for pre-K populations, elementary populations, middle school populations, and high school populations. And we will provide links in our show notes to our Healthy Minds, Thriving Kids curriculum. You can watch those videos with your kids. All videos are meant to be kid-facing, from preschool videos with hedgehogs and songs, all the way up to interviews with teens, narrated by a comedian that teach these kinds of skills. And that makes it so that in the moment, you're not referencing yourself. You might be referencing these fun videos you guys watch together. Our second question in this Q&A episode. Whenever we sit down for homework, my son immediately says, I can't do it. How do I stop him from shutting down? So when I think about how this question relates to our overall theme of emotion regulation, this is something where someone is feeling kind of overwhelming feelings, likely brought on by an interplay with their own thoughts. And then that leads to a particular behavior, which is this kind of shutdown. And the reason I break it down that way is that we who are students of a sort of cognitive behavioral framework really like to show people a triangle that has thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And what we try to look at with parents is what thoughts are occurring for your kid and how do we change those? What behaviors might be occurring for your kid and how do we change those? And then how that affects the feelings that they feel. So in this particular moment, they might be feeling despair. They might be feeling kind of sad or dread, or they might be feeling kind of anxious about their homework because they just haven't had success recently. And so based on that, they're falling into what we would call thinking traps, where maybe they're saying, this is not going to turn out well. I won't be able to figure this out. I can't do it. And this is reminiscent of a kind of like all or none thinking where what we're looking to do with a kid is just get them to take that one baby step forward rather than thinking of it so globally. You might say, I can't do it, but what I want to do is figure out how to start with problem number one. And I'm going to be right here with you trying to think through the steps in solving that problem. That's what we're trying to do when kids start thinking about things in these kind of global ways. They say, I'm stupid, or I can't do math, or I can't do this particular thing. It's getting them to put one foot in front of the other and being right with them in perhaps changing the way they engage in self-talk. And then that self-talk might result in slightly different behaviors. They might still be kind of, in an emotional place, or they might still be saying certain things, but at least they're starting the problem. And then what we're really working on in their self talk is having them assess what's happened in that trial and then inform their self talk for the future. You know, you sat down to do your homework and you said, I can't do it. I'm stupid at math. But then after we got through some of those feelings, you and I sat here and we started with problem number one, and you suddenly realized you had a strategy and you had a way of maybe working on problem number one, and you got most of that problem all by yourself. You hardly needed my help. I was really impressed. And then you worked right through problems number two and three. And when you said this is going to take hours, it actually only took us 17 minutes. What can we think the next time we come back to homework? And your kid might say, I don't know, that it'll take 17 minutes. We'd say, yes, that's great. You might think, it actually took less time than I thought last time. Or the kid comes back and says, I guess we can just start with problem number one and see what we think. And it's like, yes, instead of looking at the entire assignment, maybe you just start with the first problem and you put one foot in front of the other. Those are the processes we want to shape over time with kids who, for one reason or another, are kind of quitting too early or are not demonstrating a certain level of persistence. The last piece I'll say, and I say this in a lot of talks to educators and parents, is that when you're engaging in persistence coaching, the easy formula is reference something that they did well in the past, uh, prompt the next small step, and predict their future success. So this might be something like, hey, you know what? Last Thursday, you and I worked through these math problems pretty quickly. I'd love to start with problem number one, and I think we might be able to figure this out. It's those kinds of statements. We remind them of the success, we prompt the next small step, we predict some future positive consequence, where if we can get that being presented to a kid hundreds and hundreds of times, that becomes their self-talk, so that when they look at a challenging task in the future, they think, I had success at this before, I can take one small step, and I believe that I might see some level of success if I put some effort into this. Our third question. My son is 7 and says I'm stupid whenever he makes a mistake. I've told him he's not, and everyone makes mistakes. I feel like his brain is just wired to say it. Building on the answer I just gave to the second question here, with a kid saying they can't do homework, this is another example of a moment where a kid is engaging in labeling, which we'd commonly call a thinking trap, which is more gentle language than previous clinicians would call these things cognitive distortions or other things that seem a bit more pejorative and kind of pathologizing. But at the end of the day, this is kind of a level of thinking where we don't want kids to give themselves necessarily global labels. I'm smart or I'm stupid. We want them to really think about how their effort gets applied and then how that's the real focus of all kinds of persistence, grit, and learning opportunities in life. So if a kid says, I'm stupid, lots of parents will say, no, 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 you're so smart, which is great. Like you're trying to kind of talk back to your kid and shape maybe their self esteem or their answer to a question like, what are three words to describe you? You know, smart, funny, and, quirky, that kind of stuff. P.S. Those are probably the three words that at some level I might use to describe myself. I might include loving, compassionate in there too. But you're helping your kid answer that question for their self-esteem. But at the same time, just saying you're smart or you're stupid doesn't give you a process to work through to create evidence that kind of pushes against that worldview or that automatic reaction. So what we want to do is create evidence that shows the value of effort, the payoff for effort, and the fact, as this question asks, that everybody makes mistakes. So often try to make it more like a fun task with kids where I'll say, look, I'm not interested in proving that we're smart or stupid. What I'd like to do is I'd like to try this, and then I'd also like to try the next problem where I just do it all wrong, and we just see what that looks like. We also see lots of parents where they'll say, can I look to movies or books? Like, for example, I love the book Rosie Revere Engineer, where I've read that with my own kids. And the focus of that book thematically is that to be an engineer, to engineer anything cool, you're going to make tons of mistakes. We see this right now as we're trying to engineer, space shuttles that can be reusable and can go to space over and over and get us back to the moon. These are situations where we want to uplift that for kids and say, look, what matters here is the effort we're putting in, the fact that we're trying to apply everything that we know to solve this problem, and that oftentimes problem solving comes with dead ends and mistakes and all kinds of things. That's what we want our brains working through as processes. That's the messaging we want to give our kids. Our fourth question. How do I stop constant battles with my son, age 11, over screen time? He argues every time it's time to turn off the TV or PlayStation, and sometimes I give in because I just need to get on with stuff. So We get this question from so many parents. And this is true not just of screens. A lot of parents will be like, look, this is the digital age, this is screens. This is a lot of preferred activities with kids. It might be stopping reading books at bedtime. It might be coming in from playing an activity they love outside. It might be coming home from the park. It might be leaving the ice cream shop. There are all kinds of battles that we can get into for one reason or another where kids just don't want to stop that preferred activity and they want to keep doing it. What I'll often say to parents is if it happens as a one-off, situation, that may not necessarily be something that you have to worry about too much. You're going to have arguments from time to time. Your kid's going to try to get you to let them do more of a preferred activity. But if it's something that happens on a daily basis, like it sounds like it does in this question where the parent is referencing this as constant battles over screen time, what I'll often do is think about how can we make inclusive of the amount of screen time you're willing to give your child, that there are kind of behavioral thresholds for it. So in that sense, it sounds like this parent is willing to allow her 11-year-old child to watch TV or play video games on PlayStation, which, if we're doing that, sometimes it might be with a parent or a sibling, sometimes it might be with a friend, sometimes it might be just alone. But as a parent is navigating that, what I would probably be thinking through with a parent is how can we make it so that the amount of TV time or PlayStation access that that 11-year-old has is to some degree dependent on how regulated they stay when we tell them that there's an appropriate boundary that we're setting around how much time. In the sense that if they're arguing when they get off of TV or PlayStation, we might say to them, look, at first, we might start with kind of the least restrictive consequence. You've lost a certain portion of your TV or PlayStation time at the next opportunity that you might earn it because unfortunately you couldn't stay calm when I told you that it was time to really stop. And kids these days will argue that it's harder and harder to stop things like PlayStation because you might be right in the middle of a game and it's something you're playing with friends. And so we'll tell parents like maybe you might give some buffer zone for when it's time to turn it off. But if the kid is still reacting in a way that's very argumentative or disrespectful, then that really should dictate their access at the next opportunity. And so if you have to reduce their time first and yet still give them a portion of their time, what you're emphasizing to them is, look, we have a social contract, you and me, parent and child. I'm going to give you access to some of these privileges that aren't necessary for your survival. You need food, shelter, water, moving your body, sleep. Those are things I really want to ensure as a parent. But there's no part of my parenting contract that says you must have TV or PlayStation to survive. These are privileges. So if you're able to be calm when you come off of them, then you get all of your time the next opportunity. If not, you might lose a portion of it. And if we see this behavior happening repeatedly, that might mean a full loss of that privilege at the next opportunity. What we should see is overall a general decrease in the child's level of kind of argumentativeness about this if we're seeing this intervention, this kind of boundary setting working. We can also increase time. So we'll often say to parents, you can actually give, either a separate privilege or a little bit more of this privilege if you really see a kid making an effort and trying to change their behavior. Those are always possibilities. So, our fifth question. My teen son says everyone else has TikTok, and I'm the only parent saying no. How do I navigate that? This is one of those situations where I reflect on my own childhood and the fact that I made many arguments to my parents growing up in Georgia that I was the only kid who didn't have a particular thing, whether it was my curfew, whether it was, social life support, whether it was the fact that I didn't want to have to get a job on the weekends to have my own spending money, whether it was the car that a kid drove when I should have been grateful for the fact that my parents gave me something with two wheels that ran. And I swore at those times in my childhood that I would never be the parent who, like my parents, was maybe depriving my kids of certain things when other kids had those things. As I've gotten older, as I've gained experience, as we all gain a little bit of wisdom from our experiences, my parents were right. It is okay to be the parent who sets that boundary. In fact, I'd be more concerned as a parent now if my kids weren't coming to me with those arguments, because at some level, I want to be somewhere in the middle. I don't want to be the most restrictive parent, but I'd like to be restrictive enough that my kids see that I care about them, that I am monitoring, safety and boundaries, that I care about what they're exposed to, that I care about what they're doing, and that there may be a number of times in their lives when I am not the most permissive parent, when in fact I'm a little bit more bounded than their friends' parents, or that kid they can use as an example and say, this is just not something you're going to have or something that our family is going to allow at this age. TikTok is, of course, as are many social media apps, a massive subject of debate across the country. Whether it's the age that kids should get smartphones, whether smartphones should be present in schools, or whether social media, um, is something that kids should have access to, and exactly how and in kind of what dose and kind of to what effect. With all those messages, parents are understandably concerned and are looking to kind of limit access to some of these things. What I will often say to parents is the biggest argument that kids have about some of these things is I'm going to be left out. If I don't have a smartphone, if I don't have social media, I'm going to be left out. I won't necessarily have access to my friends. And what we see is that it's okay if your kid's a little bit of a late adopter. It's okay if your kid is left out for a while. It's okay if you delay these things for a bit. What also is really important to think about is that as you're delaying, we need to be building up the digital literacy to be ready for the responsibility of these things when you actually do allow your child access. So if your teenager says, I really want TikTok, and you say, look, for right now, for our family, this is not something I'm going to give you access to. But also, at some point in your life, you will have access to TikTok. You probably will be able to download it yourself. And so there is a reason to think about what your kind of runway is going to be up to that. Because no kid wakes up on any day of their adolescence and says, I'm just ready for all the digital world has to offer. The same way no kid just wakes up ready to drive on their 16th birthday. There has to be some learning, some literacy that is acquired in these things. So there's oftentimes a portion where we'd say to parents, this might be when you're delaying and you're restricting access. Then there's a portion where you're learning. You become your kid's digital neighbor. You maybe explore this particular thing together. You talk about what some of the risks are that you can research about this particular area of the digital world. You talk about what your expectations are for their behavior. And then you might have a period where they're engaging with this with you monitoring their access before you really release them to the wild and allow them a certain level of independence. And that, in general, for much of the digital world, is the safest way to allow kids those opportunities, very similar to a lot of other developmentally appropriate tasks of childhood. Our next question number 6 for this Q&A episode. We have 9 questions, just for those of you trying to keep some pacing here. My son believes everything he sees online, including obvious nonsense. How do I teach media literacy without lecturing? This is a key question. We also are talking about this, I believe, in an upcoming episode we are releasing with Dr. Charmaraman from Wellesley, talking about tech and kids and how you kind of build media literacy, with a number of links in the show notes to Common Sense Media, to the American Academy of Pediatrics, and to childmind.org's hub on media literacy and technology and youth, where you can find many, many articles that help you to kind of build up both media literacy and technology plans for families. But the key point in this question is this notion that when kids enter the digital world, what can be really concerning for parents is how much it can be difficult to tell the difference between what is AI and what's not, what is misinformation or disinformation and what's not. And that's an incredibly important conversation for parents to be having with their kids from the moment they begin accessing the digital or online world through the moment when their kids stop listening to them, is how do we critically think about what we're consuming, how we're consuming it, whether or not the thing that we're consuming is made to keep our eyeballs on it for as long as possible, and thus may tend toward untruth, misinformation, or disinformation just as a way to keep our attention. And then how can we can really be thinking critically as we're consuming that information and checking it for accuracy. So this is where kids learn about critical thinking while online. It's where it's important for them to understand what echo chambers might be. It's important for them to read about and understand what misinformation and disinformation is. It's important for them to understand how AI is used to create content online, or where there might be articles or things they'd read that are actually paid ads or sponsored media by companies that have an interest in pushing certain narratives. All of this is to say, we want to see a generation of youth being raised in the digital age that are thinking about how they can use technology for entertainment, for relaxation, for social connection, for information, and for education. And at the same time, if it's not being used for some of those more helpful purposes, then thinking really critically about what we're consuming and how that's affecting us, our mood, our lives, and our viewpoints. Question number 7. My 13-year-old daughter gets caught in friendship drama every week. How can I help her handle it without trying to solve it for her? And this goes back to our overall theme of emotion regulation with Dr. Brackett last week, where frequently what we see amongst adolescent kind of like social dynamics is a lot of dysregulation about feeling ostracized, left out, lonely, like you won't have friends, like that friend was your best friend last week and now they're not your friend, or you were in this group and now you're not, or this group is doing something together and they didn't invite you, or you're looking online and everybody looks super happy, but you were not included and now you're super sad. All of this is real. All of this is valid. All of this is so much of the digital and the IRL world that teens live in today. So much of helping someone to handle these things is making sure that we're a sounding board. And so I'll go back to a skill that we often, talk about with regard to couples therapy, which is when couples are kind of trying to talk through conflict or really emotionally charged situations. Oftentimes, for one member of the couple, it can be really, really helpful to just ask the question, do you just want me to listen, or would you like some help in problem solving it? And that relates to this question from a parent of how can I help her handle it without trying to solve it for her? A lot of what goes on with peers across, elementary, middle, and teenage years is that, we're dealing with situations that are critically just kind of important and at the same time run of the mill for childhood. A lot of friendship dynamics go on, and we can't save our kids from those ups and downs or the hurts that come. Obviously, we want to be on the lookout for bullying, situations where a kid is repeatedly aggressed with a major power differential and where they feel like there's no way out of it or no escape, because that can be a massive risk to their psychological health. But in most cases, when parents bring us these situations from peer dynamics, it's not necessarily bullying. It's kids being mean like kids are. It's kids engaging with friends like kids do, sometimes without regard for the feelings they hurt or the people that are kind of left out. And so a lot of this is just listening. It's validating. It's telling kids, hey, I hear you. Like these situations are really hard to navigate sometimes. Sometimes it can be hard to navigate the hurt or how much you feel like you're kind of left out, or if you feel lonely, or if you feel sad about this, or if you feel like your friends are changing or you haven't found exactly the right people just yet. As much as we can, reflect where they're at, stay a step behind them, notice how much this can be really challenging. Sometimes it can be helpful to say that you dealt with things like this when you were a kid. Sometimes teens kind of find that to be irrelevant. You can gauge with whatever teen you're talking to. And at the end of the day, after you've listened, after you've validated how difficult this is, after you've said, I really feel for you that you've got kind of these ups and downs. First, that's what most teens tell us in research they're looking for from the adults in their lives. Is just that sounding board, that sense that they can be accepted, they can share their feelings, and they can feel validated by the adults in their lives. That is so psychologically protective. You don't necessarily have to do more things. And then so often we can say to a kid, do you need my help with this situation? Do you need me to support you? Do you need us to be doing certain things at home that help you to cope with this stress? Do you need me to help you think through the ways that you might confront this situation tomorrow? Can I help think about how we can get other people in your village, other adults involved to help you feel more supported or like you're not out there on your own? Those are great questions. And if a teen says no, 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 sometimes it can be really, really hard, but we just got to realize that they're telling you it's great that you're here for me, and I might just need you to watch me ride this out. Our next question. My son keeps asking why her friend's family has more money. How do I talk about inequality in a simple, honest way? This is a very interesting question because it relates to some of the conversations that we often have with parents about privilege, about income inequality, about seeing that there are families that have and families that have not. And at the end of the day, what we want our kids to be kind of thinking about is first being, and this is kind of what we go back to in terms of principles with parents, it's that we want to kind of come back to is look, this is where our family is. This is our family life. Um, there are things to be grateful for in every single family. There are things to think about and be grateful about what we have, the love that we feel for each other, the connections that we have, the people that we feel around us. And there are a lot of different ways to frame gratitude over and above material or financial wealth. That said, we also want to validate that envy, kind of feeling jealous, or wishing for kind of like better circumstances in a certain way is completely a part of the human experience. And we can be with our kids in that. We can say, look, I do wish that at some level this was easier for us, or that we were able to do this particular thing. And I get why you might be feeling that way. And then when kids say, well, look, why is it that some folks have more money than we do? That can be a really tough conversation where adults have to think through how much they might want to share with a kid in a developmentally appropriate way about what this looks like. With young kids, it might be that we just kind of talk through the various things that affect, how much money folks have, which can be that, just kind of situations that you start out with in life in terms of level of privilege or the amount of money that you might have, the amount of education that you might get, the amount of work that you might do and how you earn money for those things, the amount of help you get from your community and how that helps you to be able to afford certain things. So, as we're kind of constructing that conversation about where money comes from and helping kids to understand that, again, we're still flipping it back to welcoming their feelings about that particular thing and then also trying to think through gratitude as it relates to our own circumstances. There's also the fact that kids might say, well, look, I want to get to a place where I can, buy you this, or I want to be able to help our family afford this. And as kids say that, we might say, look, I want to take the responsibility of that off you. It may be the responsibility of the adults around you to provide those things for now, but it's really nice that you think that way. And at the same time, here are the things you can be doing at your age to help you get to a place where you're going to be able to afford the things you need and perhaps have some extra money for the things that you might want. There's a lot to that conversation to unpack. And I'll also say, just like there are a number of articles that we also have on our website, childmind.org, about how to talk to kids about money. And then there's also partners where we've contributed to articles. I would think, just kind of off the top of my head, CNN and MSNBC, where they've written articles about how to talk to kids about money that talk about those kind of developmental differences and different age ranges when you might talk to kids about these types of things. Our last question for this Q&A episode. My two kids, ages 5 and 9, fight constantly. How do I teach empathy between siblings when I'm exhausted by the conflict? This is a great question to end on because sibling behavior is often some of the most challenging in the sense that we will see that kids can be well behaved with parents sometimes, they can be well behaved with peers, they can be well behaved to extracurriculars, and still they are at their kind of like most wild or most challenging when it's with their sibling, that person they live with, for years and years in their family and who they know every in and out of what might actually annoy them. Our focus with parents in these situations, especially with kind of rivalry between siblings, is changing the dynamic that often happens around sibling rivalry. And what I mean by that is parents often think of it like this. If siblings are playing nicely together, don't jinx it, walk on eggshells around them, let them, play nicely, like don't do anything to mess it up. And then if they're not playing nicely, that's the moment where we walk in and we say, "What's going on here?" And we start off a kind of cycle where really it becomes about like which kid can advocate better for their version of the story or get out of punishment better or try to kind of avoid the consequence. And the issue is those cycles within families actually reinforce the exact opposite of siblings getting along. It doesn't reinforce the siblings getting along and instead reinforces the idea that when there's conflict, your job as a child is to figure out how to get into less trouble than your sibling or take on less blame. And parents get so frustrated with that. What I say is let's flip the script. If you want to see your kids get along better, and we've talked about this in a couple of our episodes on managing behavior, and I'm sure we'll talk about this in a couple episodes in the future, what we want to think about is okay, first, how are we setting the siblings up so that they will be able to interact hopefully more peacefully or without as much conflict? How can we manage the situation to do that? Then we think through with parents, how do you catch your kids being good? And figure out how, instead of saying, like, don't jinx it when siblings are getting along, how do you make those the moments when you're most likely to orbit into the room and say, oh my gosh, it is so nice to see you guys sharing this thing, or choosing a TV program together, or working on your homework quietly together, or reading, if that happens, together between the siblings. But either way, we're saying to parents, how can we flip this from you only going in when they're fighting to you actually reinforcing when they're getting along? Then when there's little minor squabbles, how do we make sure to kind of redirect them, or maybe redirect their attention or direct our attention to the kid who maybe isn't becoming part of the fray, so that we just sort of actively ignore the minor stuff? How do we set up appropriate consequences if, say, a sibling gets unsafe or starts hitting or spitting or biting or something like that? We might need to remove a privilege or take some time, away from the activity, and making sure that those are kind of developmentally appropriate consequences that we set up. And then lastly, we'll often create interdependent reinforcement systems for siblings, where if we're really seeing this as an issue, for at least a brief period of time, maybe a period of weeks, we'll say to parents, why don't we set up something that we put in the fridge where we say, okay, here are the hot zones for siblings. It might be homework time after school, it might be at the dinner table, it might be during bath time, and it might be, during books at bedtime. And we can make it so that we give some form of reinforcement, a check, a star, a sticker, something like that, for actually getting along or speaking calmly or considering the other's perspective or letting the other speak, any number of target behaviors that we'd outline, and having them work toward a particular activity or thing that they'd like to do as a reward for being able to get along together. And in that way, we really flip this from, oh, my parent comes in whenever we're fighting, and my job is to take as little blame as possible and get out of trouble. And we flip the script to, my parent pays attention when we get along. My parent gives us more of their attention when we actually get along. We are also, seeing ourselves working toward privileges, things we want for actually getting along. And then over time, we can usually fade back on the, refrigerator charts or the amount of verbal feedback, and see that siblings are able to weather car rides or after school times or bedtimes a little bit better together. And with that, I want to thank you all for listening to our Thriving Kids Q&A episode this week. You will find the link to last week's episode with Dr. Mark Brackett in our show notes, along with any related resources that I mentioned during this episode. If you have a question you'd like us to cover in a future Q&A, email podcast@childmind.org. We'll see you next time.